Okay, so of course that we're going to talk about transhumanism's project of superhappiness. And basically, I'm going to give you an overview of their philosophy and what this entails and the consequences. They're also called Humanity Plus. That's their global organizational name that you can find online. So that's what they go by, as Humanity Plus. In its broadest sense, transhumanism is the view that humanity's problems can and should be solved through science and technology. And humanity's chief problems, on their view, arise from our evolutionary heritage, which has limited our biology, cognition, and psychology. Transhumanists seek to overcome these limits by applying science and technology to human persons in order to eventually become a new species of posthumans. And what they envision is a post-human techno-utopia, sometimes they refer to it as a triple S civilization of super intelligence, super longevity, and super happiness. In this techno-utopia, this triple S techno-utopia, there will be a gradual blurring of the traditional boundaries between human persons and machines. And this transition is sometimes referred to as the double blur, which is the two-pronged pursuit of building machines to be persons and then surpass humans, and at the same time, to transform human persons into machines through artificial technological enhancements. So these are the resources, I think, that are sort of introductory or basic that you might want to look at that have to do with transhumanism in general and also in their project of superhappiness. The first one is here on the left, the Transhumanist Reader. And it's just a collection of essays of transhumanists from every discipline who talk about those three projects. So it's sort of covers everything. And I don't think it's too technical. It's scholarly work, but it's something that any of you could pick up and read. The easiest way to kind of get a grasp of what their aims are is to look at their website, Humanity Plus. And you just Google it, and they have a whole website. The thing that I think is probably the most helpful, besides their mission and stating their transhumanist declaration and that sort of thing, is they have FAQ, frequently asked questions. So they have all these frequently asked questions, and then they respond to them. And I think that's probably the most useful thing. And you can kind of pick and choose what you want to find out about. The Hedonistic Imperative is also something you can find online. It's an online resource. It's a book. You can get it on Kindle. I don't think there's hard copies. I think I have it on Kindle, and then you can actually just read it online. And it's by David Pierce, and it's specifically about this project that we're talking about tonight of super happiness. So let's talk about what their ultimate aim in humans becoming post-human is going to be a journey. So it's going to have stages in it, I would say. And I wanted to show you where super happiness sort of fits into this journey. So transhumanists, of course, they seek to transform human persons through the use of science and technology by radically improving health and lifespans, enhancing our intellectual and physical capacities, and increasing our control over mental states and moods. So the two primary tenets that we're going to talk about tonight are they have a materialist philosophy of the human person, and they have a desire to control and transcend human nature. So those are kind of the two big tenets that they hold to. So first of all, transhumanists describe themselves as materialist, meaning there's no aspect of the mind and person that cannot ultimately be explained by physical forces. For the transhumanists, there's no immaterial soul that survives the death of the body. The human person is best understood on this view as a bundle of molecular and cellular complexes that can be engineered and manipulated. So for transhumanists, naturalistic evolution, so that's not theistic evolution, so it doesn't include any teleology or God, but naturalistic evolution has produced a physically inferior human being, and this is the primary problem to be solved. Nick Bostrom, he's the co-founder of Humanity Plus, and he has an essay called Transhumanist Values, and he describes the deplorable state of human nature, saying, he says this, quote, "Human nature is a work in progress, a half-baked beginning that we can learn to remold in desirable ways. Current humanity need not be the endpoint of evolution. Transhumanists hope that by responsible use of science, technology, and other rational means, we shall eventually manage to become post-human, beings with vastly greater capacities than present human beings." So because of their materialistic and mechanistic view of human persons, they believe we can control our evolution by applying technological enhancements. So now those are projects that are ongoing, and the Super Happiness Project kind of fits alongside or in right here where we have it after this third stage. As materialists, transhumanists hold that mental and emotional states like happiness are strictly determined by neurochemical functions of the brain. Transhumanists realized after a while, so the super longevity and the super intelligence projects have been going on for quite a while, probably about 20, 30 years. But they realized that no amount of enhancements from those projects would make people happy. So furthermore, the projects probably wouldn't succeed if people weren't happy. And so the Super Happiness Project developed in order to engineer happiness to get us to the final stage, which is mind uploading. And mind uploading is just uploading it's where we rid ourselves of biology, our brain and our body, and upload our brain pattern onto a machine in order to achieve artificial immortality. So that's kind of the end. Number 4 is the last stage, but they realized they really couldn't get there unless people were happy about their enhancements. But what they realized was that no amount of enhancements or technology was going to make people happy. I don't know if anybody's ever seen Louis C.K.'s comedic bit, but he has a bit you can look it up on YouTube. I think it's called "Everything's Amazing and Nobody's Happy," and it kind of brings home this point a little bit. There's a little glitch in this, and this seems like, well, they've got it all wrapped up and it's super tight. But what they fail to address about the Super Happiness Project is that if our happiness is rooted in biology, if it's just neurochemicals and it's biology, if we ultimately rid ourselves of biology in the final stage, it seems like the Happiness Project actually becomes obsolete. So if you think of it that way, it's really just a bridge or a means to become post-human, for a post-human existence, excuse me. So this is how super happiness fits into transhumanism's overall aim. The way we want to think about it tonight, the roadmap tonight for critiquing this project, and this is very brief, by the way, but we want to ask and answer why should we pursue super happiness, or why are transhumanists pursuing super happiness, and how is super happiness to be achieved? What's the method, and what is the human cost if we do go down this road? And then, but what would be the alternative if we have a Christian idea of happiness that's different from the transhumanist view? So let's go with the very first question, which is about motivations. This is David Pierce, and he's the one driving For Happiness Project. And he lives in England. He lives in the UK. And like I said, he's the co-founder with Nick Bostrom of Humanity Plus. It used to be called the Transhumanist World Transhumanist Association. And they rebranded it in 2008 to call it Humanity Plus. Anyway, that's neither here nor there. So he's the one who wrote the book, The Hedonistic Imperative, which lays out the whys, the hows, the whats, all about super happiness. And he presents the project to abolish human suffering and secure happiness. This is what he sets out in the book. And according to Pierce, through genetic engineering and neuropharmacology, future paradise engineering specialists will eliminate aversive experience from the living world. Now, tonight we're only going to talk about human super happiness, but actually his project is also for all of the animal world, so all sentient creatures. So he expects to, and we can't really go into it, but to end predation and to have some sort of birth control for animals, and that they would also have an end to suffering. So that's part of the super happiness that we're not going to talk about tonight. But let's just talk about this first, the hedonic set point. So here's the explanation that David Pierce gives. Transhumanists have an evolutionary explanation for the origin of humanity's aversive mental and emotional states. According to Pierce, humans have a relatively stable level of happiness around which they fluctuate throughout their lives, despite their experiences of positive or negative events. You may even experience this yourself. This means that even though events can affect happiness in the short term, people usually return to a stable level of happiness, and this is what is called their hedonic set point. And the general baseline of happiness, per David Pierce, is lower than it could be for all of us because our neural metabolic pathways evolved with pain and unhappiness. They were selected for survival and reproduction, not for happiness, right? Evolution aimed at survival, not for happiness. So given this understanding of this hedonic set point, Pierce emphasizes that no amount of either manipulating the external environment or human enhancement related to the other two projects will guarantee a greater degree of happiness. They have this big problem, right? So if the triple S civilization is going to succeed as a techno-utopia, this is why they say a direct biological solution is necessary to raise the hedonic set point and achieve global super happiness. So let's see. So Pierce claims that the vision of paradise engineering, his motivation, stems from a deep sense of compassion at the unimaginable scale and dreadful intensity of suffering in the world. So his compassion is motivating him. But he also says, look, if we want to live in paradise, we'll have to engineer it ourselves. If we want eternal life, then we'll need to rewrite our bug-ridden genetic code and become godlike, to have control over our human nature. So sadly, he sees that the only high-tech solutions can ever eradicate suffering from the living world. Compassion alone is not enough, nor changing the external environment or anything else that humans have tried to do throughout history. So thus, I feel like this, what he says here, and I highlighted it because it comes up in his writing a lot, to become godlike, to have control over our human nature, okay? And I feel like this, underneath the sense of compassion, belies this desire to have godlike control and recreate humanity in order to create godlike post-humans. So it seems like underlying the motive for pursuing such a society is power, the power to control human nature using science and technology. That's the impression I get from reading David Pierce. So that would be, I think he is motivated by compassion, and that does come out. But the idea of being able to control human nature and become godlike, and become godlike to have that control, is also a big part of the motivation. So how will super happiness be achieved? Now, we're already saying it's a profane application of science, and that's what he says. An earthly paradise can only be achieved by the profane application of science. So the plan to engineer happiness will progress in basically in three stages. I've broken it down into three stages. And they're kind of ranked in order of difficulty. And this is actually what he says too. The first stage begins with utopian designer drugs, which Pierce describes as long-acting, delayed action, non-neurotoxic mood brighteners. And the strategy, I think we have versions of that today and available to us. I think he means that these are even better pharmaceutical neuropharmaceuticals. The strategy is to modify the mesolimbic dopamine system, which means multiplying the number of mesolimbic dopamine and serotonin cells, because they are the cells that call the shots, so to speak. So modifying this biochemical system is key. This is what Pierce says, quote, if the dopamine and serotonin cells aren't happy, the whole organism will be miserable as well until they've got their psychochemical fix. So that's kind of the first stage, and probably the easiest one, and the one we're already on the road for, or that we all have benefits from, right? And the second stage of the program is somatic gene therapy, and that's aimed at permanently reconstructing the brain's reward pathways by disabling the countervailing inhibitory feedback processes. So somatic gene therapy treats non-reproductive cells, and therefore affects only the individual patient, not your descendants. Therefore, in order to achieve, so that's per person, like treating one person as gene therapy on one person. But in order to achieve the ambitious goal, remember, their goal is really to abolish all suffering in the sentient world. Transhumanists have to depend on germline gene therapy, which is the next stage of their program. And this isn't quite legal yet, but in this third stage, germline gene editing will focus on early stage embryonic cells, which ensure that genes are permanently corrected in all cells of the patient's body, making happiness a heritable trait. So the current mapping of the entire genome will presumably, after they've mapped everything and get all the gene expressions, will presumably reveal which combinations of genes code for structures and proteins that depress mood. These will need to be taken out or repressed. The genes associated with hyperthymia, a mental state of feeling consistently happy, will be introduced, reduplicated, and expressed in progressively larger numbers of the population and their germlines. So re-engineering the brain, this is kind of a weird part. Re-engineering the brain requires also introducing more neurons or nerve cells, which enlarges the prefrontal cortex beyond the size of the birth canal. So what a consequence of doing this type of gene therapy would be that you've got to take you've got to have an artificial womb technology. You can't have normal births happening because the head will be too big. The prefrontal cortex of the head is too big for the birth canal. So, but believe it or not, this artificial womb technology is being developed right now. So there'll be no constraints on brain size when that occurs, when that's developed, and it will then be feasible to control all the processes of fetal growth and enhancement from conception to birth. Okay. So today, gene editing like CRISPR-Cas9 and artificial womb technologies are for therapeutic. There are therapeutic uses for this technology, but it's advancing rapidly, and transhumanists are poised to use these same technologies as stepping stones for their project of human enhancement. When it comes to the ethics of superhappiness, of course, this is what I quoted in the intro. David Pierce says, if it's technically feasible, what's wrong with using biotechnology to get rid of mental pain altogether for everyone? So transhumanists take what I want to talk a little bit about their slippery slope philosophy. Usually you think of that as slippery slope is bad, right? But what they're depending on a slippery slope in this situation. They call it a slippery slope methodology. It's about how the boundary lines will inevitably be blurred between therapeutic healing and enhancement. So remember, they're not just for therapeutic healing or making someone in their natural state. They want to enhance. So they're all about enhancement. Yuval Noah Harari wrote a book recently. It's called Homo Do. He explains the slippery slope perspective this way, and this is the easiest way to think of it. Healing is the initial justification for every upgrade and enhancement. So any technology that's used right now for healing, transhumanists are all in for, because they want to upgrade it to an enhancement. So let's just take, for example, you probably know this, but plastic surgery was developed to treat facial injuries of soldiers returning from World War I, but it's now widely used to enhance healthy people, right? Genetic engineering will first be, even this germline gene therapy will be used first to eradicate deadly genetic diseases. Then, after that's been perfected, transhumanists will persuade parents to request the same technology for upgrading their healthy embryos. So parents would choose not just, we're not talking about diseases, we're just talking about their children being athletic, intelligent, cognitive abilities, happy, musical, increased memory, or a strong immune system, those types of things. So even though transhumanists rarely compare paradise engineering to Brave New World, Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, David Pierce doesn't object. So he gets that question a lot, I think, from people, comparing super happiness and the triple S civilization to Brave New World, which is obviously we think of it as a dystopia. But he says, look, in principle, he agrees Huxley's ideas of achieving utopia through neuropharmacology, gene editing, cloning, artificial wombs, and germline genetic engineering. He agrees with all that. So much like, if you remember the controller in Brave New World, Mustafa Mond, he agrees that people are motivated by psychological hedonism or super happiness, and will overwhelmingly choose technologically engineered happiness over suffering. So it's weird, the parallels that they have. But what Pierce says is that Huxley's vision to secure happiness through technology is woefully inadequate. So that's his beef with Brave New World. It's just inadequate technology. In principle, he agrees with the whole ideas of Brave New World. It's just that the technologies were inadequate. So like the pleasure drug Soma is he says it's underwhelming and one-dimensional as a utopian euphoriant. So that's talking about the neuropharmacology that he's hoping to develop will be much better than the drug Soma. But assuming that most people are alarmed by the dystopia in Brave New World, it's shocking that Pierce, comes right out to approve the scientific utopia in Brave New World. Let's see. So the third question we want to ask and answer is, what is the human cost of super happiness? What human goods are being deprived that's essential for human flourishing? That's the question. And according to transhumanist materialist philosophy, the human person is strictly physical, reduced to biology and genetics. Persons are not inherently valuable as rational, moral, free creatures made in the image of their creator. I argue that the human cost of transhumanism super happiness will cause the techno-utopia to generate into a dystopia. First of all, even if we don't look at all their methods of how they're going to do it, their philosophy of materialism exacts a high human cost. That is to say, strict materialists, a strict materialist is deprived of an adequate account of the self-evident features of human persons, such as the enduring self, consciousness, free will, mind or soul, moral knowledge, rationality, inherent value, human dignity, equal rights, meaning, and purpose. Now, we can't cover, I've written about this elsewhere, but those are the things that just a strict materialist would deprive of their philosophy of human persons. So transhumanism assumes this inadequate materialist view of the mind and human persons, and it carries it to extreme conclusions, specifically that suffering will be abolished and global happiness achieved by using biochemical and genetic engineering. I suggest that if this super happiness utopia is pursued or implemented, human well-being and flourishing will be diminished. There are at least 6 human goods that will likely be deprived, resulting in a dystopian future. So the first one is parental reproductive rights. Germline gene editing is the most radical feature of the project. Transhumanists expect a reproductive revolution of designer babies where pre-implantation genetic screening will be standard practice and artificial wombs will be available and recommended. So Pierce writes, he says, future parents who decide whether in deference to God or nature to decline gene therapy for a child they know will likely grow up depressive, for example, may be open to the charge of child abuse. Responsible parents, on the other hand, will want to get their kids the best happiness money can buy, end quote. Further, since Pierce believes that transhumanists working on the other project of super longevity will be conquering death and we will all be immortal, then population control will become a necessity. He assumes the state will take control over reproduction because, quote, decisions about reproduction cannot be left to the discretion of individual couples alone. At this stage of the transhumanist project, the freedom not to enhance, which they would say now and have on their website that you have the freedom not to enhance, this will be challenged at this point, and the state will be in charge of reproduction. Therefore, the human cost of super happiness will be the decline of parental reproductive rights. The next cost is just diminished autonomy and agency of enhanced children. So the enhanced children are made, not born. They're made as the result of the reproductive revolution. They'll be objects of their parents' design, products of their parents' will. And later, they're going to be the products of the will of the state. These children will have genetically enhanced hedonic set points, which means they are engineered with an optimal temperament of patience, empathy, sense of humor, and optimism. Parents will be masters over their children's genome, usurping their children's right to autonomy. The enhanced children will presumably have the genetic basis for the best life, for a good life, but will have lost the proper stance of the natural giftedness of life and the right to an open future. As a result, they'll experience diminished human agency, autonomy, and moral responsibility. This third human good is kind of tied to the second one, but it's a little bit different, and it has to do with the parent-child relationship. Michael J. Sandel, in his book, The Case Against Perfection, explores how reproductive engineering threatens our human flourishing. Although Sandel agrees there will be an erosion of human freedom and moral responsibility for the enhanced children, he argues these are lesser problems compared to the main problem. And he sees the main problem as that reproductive engineering promotes in parents a desire for mastery and control over their children instead of accepting children as gifts. The giftedness of life is threatened when children become objects of our design, products of our will, instruments of our ambition. Parenthood is meant to teach us to be open to the unbidden and to restrain our impulse to control. Reproductive engineering disfigures the relationship between parent and child. It deprives the parent of learning humility that openness to the unbidden can cultivate. Enhanced children will be deprived of the sense of parental unconditional love. The children will likely not view their character and talents as gifts from God or nature, but feel responsible and indebted to their parents. Hence, Sandel argues that one of the main human costs will be disfigurement of the parent-child relationship. Okay, now let's get to the number 4 human cost. It has to do with the high risk of gene editing. The project of targeted germline gene editing is a high-risk technology requiring a high degree of specificity and precision to identify, cut, splice, delete, and insert genes. This technology is prone to error, and these mistakes are irreversible, wide-ranging, and generational if it's germline gene editing. It reminds me of the pharmaceutical commercials for the cure of something, and then they say, stop using if you see all of these terrible side effects, cancer, suicide, heart attack, blah, blah, blah. I mean, it can be, if you talk to biologists about this, the fact that gene expression for happiness is not one gene, the fact that they think that they can tinker with all these genes that have to do with happiness without messing up anything else is very ballsy, really. And it gives new meaning, because Pierce says in his book, he says things like, well, if we get things right, it's going to be great. If we can get things right, it'll be great. If we can first understand, what's happening with gene expression in biology. But not only that, and let's just say they can perfect it and develop it, and there's not much collateral damage, which I would not think, but there are also risks from criminal biohackers, believe it or not, and novice biologists who are not motivated to act justly. And so the human condition is at work. They will likely gain access to gene editing technology and engineer dangerous superviruses to warp and harm the human genome. These criminal, believe it or not, and it's in an article called You could soon use CRISPR to biohack in your own home. So this is actually happening. These criminal biohackers would seek to destroy the project of super happiness. But, you know, it's funny that transhumanists, they're very, you can imagine, they're very utopian, so they're very optimistic. They rarely mention the threat of evildoers or the human condition to turn evil from good. And I think it's largely because they have no solution for the depravity of the human condition, right? You can't, there's no technological enhancement for the human condition. So number 5 is about negative emotions. So, you know, you might think, well, what's wrong with abolishing negative emotions? Well, you might want to think again, because negative emotions like anger, anxiety, sadness, depression, jealousy, guilt, shame, and fear, well, those things are planned to be abolished and positive emotions secured, like kindness, empathy, patience, pleasure. So according to Pierce's view of happiness, only positive feelings are good and negative feelings are bad for a person's well-being. Okay, suffering, pain, adverse feelings, negative feelings. This view of happiness is shallow and fails to account for the complexity and depth of well-being, namely that negative emotions are valuable for true happiness. So philosophers Diana and Tironi argue in their essay, Feel Bad, Live Well, the value of negative emotions for well-being, that negative emotions like anger, guilt, shame, and embarrassment are fundamentally valuable for our well-being. Recent research on the role that emotions play in well-being has demonstrated that negative emotions, even emotions like contempt, anxiety, disgust, are intentional states that provide information to us about the world and ourselves and are critical in leading a good life. They investigate how negative emotions can provide evaluative knowledge and understanding about the world. For example, our moral anger can draw our attention to genuine injustices and how we should respond. They also illustrate how negative emotions can provide self-knowledge and self-understanding. For example, by experiencing guilt, I'm provided with a signal that I may have done something wrong. This can initiate self-reflection about my integrity and possibly self-reform. It's reasonable to expect that if the transhumanists succeed in abolishing negative emotions, people will be deprived of valuable evaluative knowledge and understanding about the world and themselves that is necessary for happiness and well-being. Remember too, I mean, I don't know if you can visualize this, but our external circumstances and our external environment are not changing on this view. Transhumanists are not changing our circumstances or the world or the environment. Our negative emotions responding to the world is what changes. So they're taking away our negative response and suffering, but not actually changing any external circumstances or the environment. Robert Nozick makes a similar point, and he has a book called Anarchy, State, and Utopia. With his thought, he has a thought experiment, which is kind of cool, called the experience machine. He argues that there is more that matters to us than our feelings. Even if we had the option to plug into an experience machine that would give us any experience we desired, we would likely realize that what matters more is what we want to do, is that we want to do certain things, not just have an experience of doing them. We want to be a certain sort of person, not just have an experience of being that person. What we are is important to us. Nozick concludes saying, perhaps what we desire is to live. It's an active verb. We want to live ourselves in contact with reality, and this machines cannot do for us. If we if what we are is important, then transhumanism's paradise engineers cannot genetically engineer happiness for us. By imagining the kind of artificial happiness offered to us by David Pierce, we realize that living our lives in contact with reality matters more. This last one you might think is bizarre, but actually this one I really, like to think about. It's art and literature. So in David Pierce thinks that he doesn't really have much of a moral philosophy. He's a utilitarian. He's obviously a negative utilitarian, but he thinks that when all of our aversive suffering and negative emotions are gone, that all of our art and culture will become obsolete. We'll have to change. It won't mean anything. It will lose its meaning. So in this respect, this is what he says. After our human brains are enriched with happiness, Pierce expects that the art and literature we once enjoyed in our unenhanced state will seem perverted. Much like Mustafa Mann's assessment of the cost of happiness, Pierce expects that the classical literary canon may fall into obscurity. He assumes we will not be edified by the cultural artifacts of a bygone era. Anticipating our moral sense will change if suffering is abolished, Pierce argues that morality in the contemporary sense may no longer be needed. Now, if the philosophers we talked about in the last step, Diana and Tironi, about negative emotions, if they're right about the human cost of abolishing negative emotions, Pierce's expectation to lose the art and literature canon, it seems plausible to me. But here's a poem I like by Naomi Nye. It's called Kindness. And I'm just going to read 2 stanzas of it to make my point. She says, this is the poem. Before you know kindness as the deepest thing inside, you must know sorrow as the other deepest thing. You must wake up with sorrow. You must speak to it till your voice catches the thread of all sorrows and you see the size of the cloth. Then it is only kindness that makes sense anymore. Only kindness that ties your shoes and sends you out into the day to mail letters and purchase bread. Only kindness that raises its head from the crowd of the world to say, it is I you've been looking for, and then goes with you everywhere like a shadow or a friend. So imagine you're an enhanced, super happy child person. So you've had no negative emotion. You've been engineered. Having never felt great sorrow or loss, so you've never had those feelings, and read the lines of the poem again, right? You must know sorrow as the other deepest thing before you know kindness as the deepest thing inside. It's easy to see how the meaning of kindness in the poem is lost. And along with, I would say, much of the literary canon, that we would find it lacks meaning if we were an enhanced, super happy person, having never felt great sorrow or loss. So that's just something to think about. The last thing is that just what I said before, that this whole project will ultimately become obsolete in the last stage of mind uploading, because if all of this is biologically rooted, if our feelings are biologically rooted, then this is the project is not needed in the last stage of mind uploading. So I just want to conclude by saying, if human persons are more than physics and chemistry, and happiness is more than genetically controlled biochemistry and neurons firing in the brain, then transhumanism's solution for super happiness is inadequate. Their reductive methods of genetic engineering to achieve superhappiness lead to dangerous and extreme absurdities that deprive us of the human goods required for human flourishing. So that kind of concludes our critique, but we don't want to stop quite yet, because I really feel like we should have something to say to transhumanist ideas about it gives Christians a unique opportunity to speak to people who are I was going to give you a history of how I think we've gone a little long and you probably have questions, but some people think of the way that David Pierce and utilitarians would think about happiness as feeling good, and the classical and Judeo-Christian view is about being good. In other words, that there was a mistake that happened in the like early 1800s, and there was a huge shift in the view of happiness. So it's what Mortimer Adler calls it a philosophical mistake, where people shifted in their view of thinking of happiness as related to virtue and began to think of it only as a feeling good versus being good. So virtue-based theories of happiness are not new to Christianity. Socrates and Plato and Aristotle all had a virtue-based view of happiness. But by that, I mean that happiness to them was the good life, or eudaimonia, flourishing life. It doesn't have to do with fleeting pleasures. It has to do with a virtuous life. Just to go through, I have a lot on this, but I know that y'all probably, if you're interested, we can talk about it, but there is a history of it. Because for most of the history of the world, happiness was tied to virtue. And so Aquinas then kind of built on Aristotle's virtue-based view. And so the Christian view also is I feel like a virtue-based view of happiness. This is the book I recommend. This is just a great book, and it has to do with spiritual disciplines, but it talks about this philosophical mistake and takes you through a sort of a Christian theistic view of happiness. So one thing you notice in all of the transhumanist writings, it doesn't matter which project you're reading about, is very self-centered and so kind of narcissistic. So all of their enhancements are towards the individual person, enhancing you becoming post-human type of thing. But the gospel calls us to be God-centered and other-centered, and that's the kind of life. And of course, we find that in Luke 17:33, which is just whoever strives to save his life will lose it, and whoever loses it. And then Matthew 6:33 is seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things shall be added to you. So you find these paradoxes in Christianity. You also have 2 Corinthians 3:18, which is, so all of us who have had that veil removed can see and reflect the glory of the Lord. And the Lord, who's the Spirit, makes us more and more like him as we are changed into his glorious image. All that to say is that the aim and the end of the Christian life is transformation. So the transhumanists want to be transformed into an artificial machine person, artificial immortality on this earth. But Christians, we have such a richer response for the transhumanists, not only in the happiness, but in what our end is. And I like what C.S. Lewis says. He says, you can't get second things by putting them first. You get second things only by putting first things first. And so what the transhumanist is doing is putting pleasure and feeling of happiness first, and they can never get it. But if you put second thing, it's a second thing, pleasure or happiness or feeling is a second thing, and you can only get it by putting first things first. And we can talk about this because we're pretty much done. But if you were able to see that movie, A Hidden Life, it's the truth.
I've been trying to get them to watch this forever.
Gosh, it is so good. Everyone has to watch it. You should probably watch it together. But and so anyway, let me close this, and then we can talk about it for a second.
I described to my friends, like, if you ever want to see what actual martyrdom looks like, that's the film. Like what, not what I guess commonly American Christians say, like, what does real martyrdom looks like in a modern setting that we see the church fathers talk about, the early church, like we see during the Diocletian purges, stuff like that. Like, that's like,
yeah, so just a little bit. So how I think this illustrates what I'm talking about is Franz Sugarstadter was, I'm probably not saying his name right, he was an Austrian believer. He refused to fight for Nazi Germany, and he refused to swear loyalty to Hitler. And he had 2 young daughters, a wife. He was tortured and beheaded in 1943. And his life, they have rich letters. He was imprisoned for a while, and the letters between he and his wife show what he was going through and why he would sacrifice, why he felt so strongly to do the right thing. He exhibited, when I say the virtuous life is the happy life, he exhibited every virtue, I think, and this is in his letters too. He expressed that he was living the good life by doing what he thought was right, and yet he gave his life. But of course, he's in eternity. But and that's why he could do it. But he's a great example of putting first things first.